Hello, Harville here.
And Helen.
And we are excited to be with you by Zoom. We wish we could be with you in person. And we are honored to be invited also to present our newest thoughts about Imago relationship couples therapy. And we want to bring you up to date with our latest thinking. And we want to start with the latest thinking by connecting it with some much earlier thinking in which many years ago we began to work on what is called the relational paradigm. And we began that work because prior to working on the relational paradigm, we had spent a lot of time working with what could be called the individual paradigm. And that is the way we looked at couples was that they were two individuals trying to have a relationship, having difficulty doing it. And it was because of communication and conflict. And that we would help people develop better communication skills and learn how to resolve conflict. So over the years, we discovered that that does not work well, that what works better is to have couples talk with each other. And we began to think about moving from their inner world to the relationship that they have with each other and began to focus on what we call the relationship as the third item in a couple. There's the two partners and their relationship. And so we developed that for many years. And then we began eventually to call that the space within, because we had come to another phrase that we thought was a wonderful phrase to account for the shift to the relational paradigm. And we call that the space between. And we want to talk today about the space between, how that originated and what it means and how it's populated.
I had been reading a book written by a Jewish mystic, philosopher. His name was Martin Buber, and the book was The I, Thou. And the book was about most people treat each other like an I, it. Like, you said you loved me, so why don't you do what I want? And why aren't you doing the way I see it? And like Harville's supposed to be an it and care about me, and then I'm happy. Mm-hmm. And then the other person feels that way too. And the essence of the book is shifting from the I, it to the I, thou. And that was the title of the book. And when he unpacked his idea of the I, thou, like, I love you, and what can I do to make your day go better? Martin, I'm treating Harville like a thou. Buber says that the energies of love flow from the universe into the space between the two people. And that's where love is, in the space between. So we took that concept and we're going to share more about that.
Yes, and that the space between is a real place. And it's not an imaginary place, and it's not an empty space. But
yeah, people go, well, that's dumb. It's invisible. There's nothing there.
Right.
Not true.
And it's not true. And that assertion that the space between is a real space, that it is filled, that it is occupied, is now grounded in the newest science of human sciences called quantum field theory. Now, for a long time, as we were working on the relational paradigm, we couldn't find the science in which to ground the relational paradigm. So we operated pretty much out of our clinical observations and psychological observations because we couldn't find a way to ground it in a science. the inner world, the space within, or what we traditionally call subjectivity, had been grounded in a science, the science of classical physics, which gave us the concept of the atom, which is the model out of which the idea of the individual was developed for psychology. And that individual had an inner world called subjectivity, which we later called the space within. So we could root all of that in classical physics, but there was no place for a long time that we knew of, although it existed, we just hadn't discovered it, to ground the space between, until we discovered that in quantum mechanics, there is a subfield called quantum relational physics. And this quantum relational physics has been working for years on a similar problem. Their problem has been to figure out what Newton also asserted to be the case, that Newton said everything is made of atoms. And in quantum physics, for a long time, staying with that, we're splitting the atom, then splitting the particles that came out of the atoms, and then splitting those particles. They always found at least 3 other particles. And therefore, it appeared to be a dead end that they could say that everything is made out of a particular particle. Because that never happened, that they could arrive at that out of which everything is made. So they began then to speculate in quantum field theory about whether the thing, in quotes, at the bottom of everything, out of which everything is made, is a thing, or whether it is the relationship between things. And now they've decided, the quantum field theorists have decided, that everything is made out of the relationship between things. That the relationship between things is what is fundamental, what is real, and out of which everything comes. So all of a sudden, we became aware that we can ground the space between, as a space between human beings, in quantum relational field theory, and therefore we have a science for the space between. So we now say that that the space between is where life is lived. This is where we interact, and interaction is where life is lived. And therefore, it is where all problems occur. And those are the problems that are brought to the therapist. So the space between is where all the healing occurs. And so we have moved out of the space within now, which is the inner world of the self, to the space between persons as the location of all of our activity. And Helen and I today want to talk about how the space between can be regulated and how it is used for therapeutic purposes. And we want to say that there are 4 basic steps in the therapy process. There are 4 basic theses in Imago relationship therapy. And we want to talk about those 2 things, both as structures of the therapy and also as the steps in the therapeutic process. And we're going to start with something most of you are very familiar with, which is the Imago dialogue process. And then we will talk after that about the emergence of the concepts of empathy as essential. And then after that, zero negativity as non-negotiable. And after that, of affirmation. So there'll be those 4 points, and we'll make them and remind you of them, that this now constitutes in a short form, Imago relationship therapy. And Helen's going to start.
Because there is something that we talk about, that there is a physics of the space between, a physics, if you will.
Yes.
That when there's anxiety in the space between, I want to leave the room right now. Mm-hmm. He wants to leave the room.
Yes.
And, or if I'm over talking, or if suddenly Harville feels anxious, when 2 people feel, one of 2 people or both people feel anxious with each other, the space between isn't safe.
No.
When there's anxiety, people distance. But only 4 things make the space between safe, where a person can connect with the other person. And number 1 is dialogue, as Harville said. And what's interesting about dialogue is, I'm going to mention 2 things. One, that it's interesting that in people teaching dialogue, there have been books on dialogue, but a man who a lot of people have heard the name lived 300 BC. It was Socrates.
Wow.
And he created Socratic dialogue and was teaching it to other people. And it was so disruptive to the government. The youth was following him and learning how he was doing, and they put him to death. So since then,
like it was dangerous.
The whole world has loved monologue. But anyway, the dialogue process is, Harville suggested I tell the story. Even when we were dating, we would sometimes fight, even though I had heard Harville
sometimes
give lectures on
all the time.
I had heard lectures give on stages of relationship, and I thought this guy was brilliant. But then when it came to talking, we didn't talk very well. And it was in the middle of a fight. Harville wanted me to let you know that I said, Harville, why don't one of us talk and one of us listen? And so he said, well, this is really calming me. And at the time he had a clinical practice, and he took it there and began to unpack. Yeah.
Well, I took it to practice because I was not working with couples, having them take turns talking. It was more that I was doing parallel psychotherapy, having them talk to me and me helping them understand what was going on inside them about their past and about their defenses. And it was a pretty inefficient form of therapy. About 35 to 40% success rate was measured at the time. Mm-hmm. So I took this interaction that Helen presented to the clinic and began to, and it took us about 10 years to experiment with couples, bring back and experiment with ourselves. But I give Helen and Socrates credit for bringing dialogue into the world. Socratic dialogue about 300 BC and Imago dialogue about 30 years ago.
And Dan Siegel. Well, first, I love studying the brain, and everyone knows we have a lower brain, and sometimes we call it the crocodile brain. That the brain, the most complicated organ in the universe, is the 2.8 pound organ in people's skull. But I simplify it. Well, Harville and I have agreed. I simplify it. I often do the brain's lectures. The crocodile brain is the lower brain. It keeps you alive. So it's going to protect itself. But if you use the sentence stems of the dialogue, it moves you to the upper brain and the neocortex, and you have a completely different neurochemistry. And there's left brain knowing, right brain knowing, and then the sentence stem, and is there more about that? Put you in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that releases dopamine, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin. And when it's released, it flows through your bloodstream, as opposed to the crocodile brain, adrenaline and cortisol. And you get sick more and you have a weaker immune system, and you die earlier if you have a lot of cortisol. Diseases. Yep. So there are all sorts of reasons to use the dialogue process.
Yeah. So the dialogue process as you know, and so this is nothing new to you. To add to your comments about the brain, Helen, one of the things you also say, and you may want to elaborate a little bit more, is that when you practice the sentence stems, the structure of the dialogue process rigidly, that repetitive practice does
neuroplasticity.
It
strengthens that
which
part
is
of
a
the
big
brain.
word for
it reinforces this healthy part of the brain. You get a healthier brain. It creates a different kind of brain.
Yeah. And meaning that the brain is plastic. The brain changes with experience. So that dialogue changes the brain. And that was one of the things you put together as you began to work on the interface between the brain and dialogue. So that's the amazing thing, that the safety created by the structure of the dialogue process changes the brain and also makes it possible for couples to experience connecting, because, as you said earlier, in the physics of the space between, you remove anxiety, then connecting can happen. And if you don't remove anxiety, then defenses will happen. And therefore, that's the problem couples came to solve, and it gets created by the therapeutic process itself. So is there more about dialogue?
Yeah, and Harville's going to do number 2.
So number 2 of the 4 steps is empathy. So empathy, we know, is a quality that comes with birth and with human beings, and it's been called proto-empathic response. It's been seen in infants. But the strange thing is that the capacity for empathy, or the practice of empathy, is very, very rare with human beings on the planet. So something happened to all of us early in life that interrupted our empathic ability, and the proto-empathic evidence that was there has not shown up. So what is important is to bring empathy back into human experience. And one of the best places to do it is to bring it into couples work, because empathy in couples work is a part of creating the safety necessary for connecting to occur. And connecting is the restoration of that original state. And we would call that healing, but we don't actually have to do that. I like the word transformation better, that dialogue and then empathy. So the question then is, how do you get empathy back? How do people learn to be empathic? And here we found the value in the work we've done with the impact of childhood on marriages, on intimate partnerships. And but it's not so much that childhood makes intimate partnership, knowing about childhood makes intimate partnership work better, that knowing what is inside helps you with the outside better. We think the most important value of exploring your memories about childhood to find what was challenging up to traumatic is that you can now know that whenever your partner, acts a little weird or crazy or reacts in a way that's typical, that all couples do, is that if you know your partner's early childhood challenge, the thing that was the most difficult for them, you know that when they react to you, they are reacting because a memory has been triggered of an early childhood pain. If I know that is what's going on with Helen, if I then move out of what would be normal, which is a counter reaction and a counter criticism, to curiosity, and then move from curiosity to empathy, and to say, I can imagine that must be really challenging for you when I do that, and I can see that it really is hard, and I blah blah blah. I'm knowing that she's coming from a triggered memory from childhood, and my being empathic with her not only regulates the interaction in our relationship, but at that moment of empathy, I in fact contribute to the resolution of her childhood issue that produced that reaction in her, and vice versa with me. So that empathy becomes the most powerful connecting energy in couples therapy. So we want to look at the past, not in order to just become informed about who we were in the past, but because the past helps couples know that they live with a wounded person, and that if they're empathic about their partner's wounds, they then, in fact, do the healing that is necessary. Mm-hmm. So that's step number 2.
And the third is zero negativity. And that means saying things in a way where two people don't polarize, but they connect. So using dialogue helps with that. And having empathy for one another helps. By the way, when I was trained, I have a degree in psychology, and I was trained in primal therapy about the childhood within. And so I was a good dialogue partner with Harville as he was developing this. The next was zero negativity. And we are transparent when we lecture these days about the fact that zero negativity is great for anyone to use, and it saved our marriage because we had decided to divorce.
About 22 years ago.
And this, our couples love to hear about it because they're in a workshop, because they're often with their partner and they're about to divorce. And so we shared what we did, which allowed us to throw the divorce papers away. And I was the kind of person, when we married, I was dedicated to him to be a success or succeed at his goals and make his dreams come true. But he needed to dress better, and he needed to sometimes talk more succinctly. And he always solidified the theory great, but his bookshelves were messy and da-da-da, and I was just da-da. And whereas Harville, his early wound was his parents not letting him have time alone to read and to write. And so Harville was on his own a lot. And eventually we had such different styles of marriage that we decided we might divorce. But then we learned I needed to do things differently, which is not over talk around Harville. And Harville needed to come out of his office every once in a while and spend time with me. Because he loved writing, but then he loved Star Trek, and I'd go, why don't we go out for dinner? And he'd go, oh, I've got to work. But then I could hear he was watching Star Trek. I was sad. So we learned to do some things differently. And this is where you practice asking for what you want by saying what you want, not what you don't want. And we have a process that people can use called the ouch or being, or we have if ever Harville does something for like LL, like sometimes he's writing, and he's coming out, and it looks like he's glaring at me. And I go, LL. And then sometimes I'm frustrated, and he goes, VT, voice tone. And we share this in our workshop. Harville says before a couple begins, shift from the glare to the gaze. And he has a picture of a cat on the monitor, the slideshow monitor, and a cat you know how cats look, little beady eyes. And then the second is the basset hound. And
the little dreamy eyes.
So look at your partner with dreamy eyes. And we say we threw away our divorce papers by doing these few things.
Yeah. And I think if I could add something to what you said is that we started off with this being pretty much of a personal practice. And we began to introduce it to couples with some hesitancy because we weren't sure how generalizable it was. And that zero negativity has now become non-negotiable. Yeah. That when we work in our workshops with couples, we invite them in the first hour, about hour and a half into the workshop to sign a zero negativity pledge. And for the workshop, and then to sign a zero negativity pledge.
Just for this one weekend. Just no negative practice, no negativity.
And then later to re-sign a pledge for 60 days after the workshop, because we've now learned that it takes about 60 days of regular devoted practice to move into a habituated process of monitoring your negativity. And that it's necessary, not just optional or a good thing to do, necessary, because negativity and intimacy just don't go together. Negativity and safety don't go together. You have to be safe to be intimate. And so it finally came really clear that negativity is a non-negotiable.
Oh, and this is where you have to learn to ask for what you want.
Right.
What Harville wanted from me was to respect his private time. And then you told me one day, Helen, would you ask me more questions?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just ask me something. Ask me more questions. Well, there again, I got to go to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And I've told others that shutting up and listening to Harville and wondering, and maybe Harville, I'd ask him a question and then he wouldn't answer, like we were taking a walk. Mm-hmm. And I always swore on the walks, don't talk. And just ask him questions. And if he didn't ask questions, I didn't talk. And I could just enjoy the walk and looking at nature. And I've said I was the lucky one by not talking and relaxing.
Yes.
When I was with Harville instead of trying to improve him.
Yes. So we invite everybody to go to the zero negativity process, invite all of you doing therapy to invite couples to do that. So the final thing, number 4, is affirmation. Now, this is a little different from appreciation, which is another thing that y'all are familiar with that we have taught before, is that you should start off and train couples to do appreciations, and we would stick with that. And appreciation is, however, a gratitude for something your partner did for you. And so you appreciate that. And affirmation is a bit more profound than that and includes appreciations. But an affirmation has to do with what we would call affirming the other, the being of the other, independent of what that other has ever done for you or plans to do for you or agrees to do for you. The other, the partner, the human being is valuable intrinsically, valuable because they exist. They're valuable because the universe gave them their reality. And they're not valuable because they're useful, which is the I-it relationship of Martin Buber. They're valuable because they exist. And if couples start with understanding that they live with this person to whom the universe has given being, which is intrinsically valuable, it actually changes their sense of who they are, who they're living with, and also of who they are. So to affirm being, independent of being valuable, so that I affirm Helen's value independent of her value to me, but simply because she is valuable. And then I add, you also are valuable because you brought me a cup of coffee in the morning, and because you smile at me, and because of the thousands of other things that we interact with, like co-doing lectures like this and doing workshops and all the other things, but to affirm the being of the other. Mm-hmm. And we call that unconditional acceptance of the other. Mm-hmm. This also now helps to understand how you need to remove negativity from that person who is intrinsically valuable, and how we need to become empathic when that person reacts because they have a memory of a painful childhood, and we become empathic with them. So now we have the 4 steps of therapy. These are also the 4 fundamentals of the Imago theoretical system: dialogue, empathy, zero negativity, and affirmation. And when we take couples through that therapeutic process, helping them learn dialogue, become empathic, release negativity, and practice affirmations, they then cannot help but change, because this becomes a transformational process. So we just want to remind you that the space between is a real space occupied by the energy out of which we are made. This space is constellated by what we put into it. What we put into the space between creates what goes inside us as memory, which becomes the space within. So to create new content in the space within, we have to create new interactions in the space between. And therefore, the space between becomes the location of all our thinking, and also of all of our research, and of all of our practice. And we just want to share that with you. And Helen, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
Joke books helped. We got joke books, and at dinner, Harville and some of the kids would be one side of the table. I would, and just anything to avoid zero negativity and create memories that are fun and funny. That too.
So thank you very much for having us at your first National Romanian Imago Conference. We are honored to be asked. We wish we could be there in person. We love the fact that we can be there by Zoom. We hope all of you will enjoy all the aspects of this conference, and we'll see you someday, hopefully, down the path of the Imago process as the Imago world continues to enlarge. Thank you very much. Goodbye.